Welcome to another edition of the Gary Anderson F1 Show. I'm Ed Straw, and as always, joining me is the star of the show, former Jordan and Jaguar Technical Director, Gary Anderson. And this episode is all about what our listeners want Gary to talk about, a special Ask Gary Anything episode. So for this special edition, we've asked for questions from our YouTube audience. If you've not seen our YouTube channel yet, search for The Race, where you'll find multiple videos released every week. Recently, we put out 8 things Williams' new owners need to do next, F1's new payment details explained, a look back at Ferrari and McLaren's abandoned IndyCar projects of the late 80s, and there's also free and live coverage of Super GT, Super Formula and the British GT Championship as well. If you're wondering how we ask the questions, check out the community section of The Race's channel, something I must admit I never knew existed, but it's well worth a look as we now post all sorts of interesting things there. And remember to follow Gary on Twitter, on @GaryAndersonF1. This episode's also being released on our YouTube channel, so for those of you listening on YouTube, thanks for checking it out. And if you like what you hear, you can listen to Gary's thoughts every week. Just search for the Gary Anderson F1 Show on your favourite podcast platform. That's enough from me. Gary is, as I say, the star of the show, and I'm just going to open up with a really important question, Gary, which is how often do you get mistaken for the world darts champion, Gary Anderson? That came from Giara, and Arne also asked how good your darts game is in comparison with what he calls the real Gary Anderson.
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Who is the real Gary Anderson? You know, he needs to be stand up and be counted. I think my darts games might be better than the other Gary Anderson's racing car design. I've hit the odd bull now and again. I'm not sure that I was actually aiming for it, but I've hit the odd bull. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, obviously he's a very famous guy, and it sort of whenever you look on the internet or whatever, looking for somebody or somebody looking for me, it's always interesting that the darts player comes up much more often. So obviously he's made a bit of a fan base. But yeah, lots of times, you know, people have asked me, "Do you play darts?" You know, mainly joking, to be honest. But no, it's interesting because someday we must meet up, I think, and have a chat over a pint, because that's what darts players have, isn't it? A good pint of beer somewhere. But yeah, I've been confused a little bit with him, but not too much.
I've known a few race car designers who like the odd beer as well, so it's not just darts players. But I'm pleased we've addressed that important issue. So let's move on with the questions. Lots to get through. Surya Vikas asks, why does Ferrari have such a bad chassis apart from having the slowest engine? Vettel constantly complains of lack of rear. Why can't the team improve with such resources?
I think it comes basically from a bit of a false sense of security. You know, if we do look over the last couple of years, there has been something going on in the engine department that has meant they've had an exceptional performance from the engine, and that's all gone away. But while you've got that, and you know the car is quick, and you can win the odd race or be in the front row fairly often, I think the team gets a bit of a false sense of security because, you know, it doesn't understand its deficit really. They could, whenever they had a good engine, for example, they could run more downforce in the car. They could stabilize the car with that and not really pay a big price. You know, when they had a bad race in 2018 or the early part of 2019, they were probably, you know, 4th or 5th or something on the grid. And that just comes from the fact that you can set the car up to suit the inadequacies of the chassis because you got that extra power. So it's a spiral to nowhere in a way. You know, the most important thing is you have to be realistic about where you are with everything. You know, they haven't done. On saying that, they haven't done a great job in just developing the car itself either. You know, they haven't moved on since I think they came out with this concept in 2017 with the side pods and the way they did the crash structures. It might be in 2016 even. But anyway, they came out with it, you know, early on with the crash structure outside of the front of the side pod leading edge and moving the side pods back further to get it further away from the front wheels and give the barge bores more opportunity to work better. And most teams have gone that route in one way or another, or to one level or another. But Ferrari haven't moved on from there. So they shot their bolt, and then they've sat there with what they think is, you know, a good concept, and it probably is. But they just, as I say, they get this false sense of security from the engine performance they had, which was deemed to be against the regulations, and suddenly you find yourself in the situation you're in now, where you've got to do all of that work. You've got to catch up with your engine program somehow, because what you've been getting has been, as I say, near the mark as far as legality has been concerned, and obviously the FIA have stamped down on it. And also on the way the chassis is dropped behind. So suddenly everything, all the eggs in the basket have all broken, and they have to fix everything at the same time, and they're not getting there with it. So it's a tough one, and, sort of resurrecting it will take time for sure. I'm not quite sure that Ferrari have that time within the structure they have, and I can see them starting to change structures quickly and dramatically to try and at least get one of those areas, the engine or the chassis, to a level where it's a much better package.
The next question draws on MotoGP and probably alludes to the concessions rule they've got there. This is from Ari Mahmood, who says, what are the challenges F1 faces adopting in the MotoGP structure where customer teams regularly compete for podiums? Most importantly, MotoGP riders can actually make a difference. I want to see F1 drivers to be great warriors. Kimmy Lewis also asked a similar question about equal or fair racing in F1, similar to MotoGP. And of course, we should say that fresh from KTM breaking through as a winning manufacturer, Miguel Oliveira won the Styrian Grand Prix for the Tech 3 satellite KTM team. So that's just a testament to how well it's working, isn't it?
It is a testament to how well it's working, and I completely agree with both of you with your questions and the fact that, it is real racing. And, you look. I watched the race at the weekend, and there wasn't a second of it that wasn't having some sort of excitement here and there. Even if it's just, a driver catching up from behind, they can do it. Okay, a motorbike's smaller than a racing car on the same track, so there is more room for manoeuvre. But it's not like that either. A racing line's a racing line. If you want to be on it with a motorbike, you've got the fastest racing line is always the fastest racing line. And you've got to put one up the inside. You've got to do some sorts of daredevil manoeuvres. Now, at the end of the day, each rider has to survive, has to look after himself. So he's not going to do something stupid, or very, very few of them do things that's really stupid. Their survival is the biggest basic instinct. But the way that the formula is spread out with the privateer teams and the fact that the teams that aren't so good, like KTM had, the concessions so that they get more testing and they can have more engines, or however it all works. I don't know 100% the detail of it. It does mean that if you're not performing well, you do get an opportunity to get yourself up there. You do have more than two bikes. You've got your privateer team as such, and they're semi-works teams. They do work with the manufacturer quite closely. So there's no real super independent team. And I think in Formula One, to be honest, and this is no slur on anything, but you could take the Mercedes and the Racing Point team, and you could take Red Bull and Toro Rosso, I was going to say, whatever they're called, AlphaTauri. You could say they're good examples of that, but because of the regulations in Formula One, they can't exploit it to the level they want to, really. Again, Ferrari and Haas. So is it what Formula One wants? I think Formula One will always fight against copying what makes another formula successful. But it has been very successful in MotoGP. And I know whenever they came in with the control ECU and that for the MotoGP, Honda, the big boys all fought it. And then they discovered that actually it doesn't do any harm. You still got bigger budgets. You can still employ better riders, and you still can go out there and win if you get all the parts together. But it's great to see a privateer team win a MotoGP race, especially with KTM, because they've been the underdog, but they got a good little bike right now. So I'm sure a lot could be learned if Formula One wanted to follow MotoGP, and I'm sure it could be a lot better. But I don't think they'll want to do that. Everybody wants to create their own ideas and their own formula.
Next up, we've got a question from Alex K, who says, if F1 cars had movable aerodynamic elements, would drivers be able to cope with the G loads?
Well, I think to a certain level, yes. I mean, the drivers can cope with the G loads. It depends. The G factor is something that's just the constant. If it's too high for too long, it gets a bit troublesome. I was working in America at the time whenever we had the first race in Texas, and it's a 1.5 mile oval from memory. And they'd been there testing, and they were doing speeds of 220 miles an hour average speed. It's a pretty fast little track, well banked. And we went there for the race weekend. And on the Friday, suddenly the speeds were 245 miles an hour average. And no problem, everybody went round and round. And then I think it was only one incident really. Nothing dramatic happened. Somebody spun, I think, on a bump in the pit straight. I think it was Maurizio Gugelmin, actually, from memory. And The next morning, for Saturday practice, suddenly there was a couple of cars went out and did a couple of laps and came in, and nobody was running, and everybody was wondering what's going on here. And actually, it was the day after the drivers had, suffered too high a G level, and they were suddenly getting in the car and going out there, and they were suddenly feeling dizzy again whenever they just started to push. So it was the day after that affected them. And the race ended up being cancelled because the G level was too high, and drivers weren't passing out because of the G level, but whenever they got back in the car and started going fast again, it made them dizzy. So you have got to be careful of it, obviously, and it couldn't be too high. So there's a happy medium somewhere. I think the cars today, pulling 4G laterally in long corners and pulling 6G, 6.5G under braking in spikes, that's quite high. So I wouldn't like to see it go much above that, to be honest.
Yep, still a fair bit of stress on the drivers, but yeah, I guess if you had unfettered aero, it would become problematic. Moving on to a question from Nick. Says, is the Red Bull made for Max Verstappen, the Mercedes for Lewis Hamilton, and the Ferrari for Charles Leclerc? Can a car be designed more for one driver and disadvantage the other as a result? We also had a few other questions asking about this kind of idea of designing a car to suit a driver and how that works. So is it something that you can really do?
Well, the trend in design, or the sort of priorities in design, will come from driver input. Some drivers like the car to be a little bit oversteered, like the car to be free. In other words, the rear of the car, they don't mind the rear of the car moving a little bit. Kimmy's an example of that. He doesn't mind the rear of the car being a bit light, but he just can't live with understeer. Other drivers, like Jenson Button, he hated the rear of the car to be light. So there is a tendency towards how you would look at your aero maps, as far as optimizing it for the driver that sort of is there to give you the best return. But it's never really as black and white as that. You couldn't design a car that basically would suit one driver and not the other one at all, even if it is understeery or oversteery. You can always change the balance a bit here and there to bring it back to basis. But there probably will be a point where the car is at its best to suit the driver that has most input to the team. And that's why, a sort of number one driver sort of comes out of it, because he pushes for what he wants. He likes a certain way the car has to handle, and if you get that return from every time you put something on the car that's new, that's developed to suit that situation, if he gives you back lap time because he goes faster, then you tend to sort of go towards that direction. But to sit down black and white and design a car right now that is going to be to suit an understeery driver or to suit an oversteery driver, it's very, very difficult to do that. I think that evolves through time as you sort of get the setup of the car sorted out, and what of your two drivers, or who of your two drivers gives you the best lap time return when you do you get everything in the right direction.
The next question, again on design, quite a broad question from Tentacles45, says, how do you even begin designing a car?
There's always leaders out there. If you never design anything from new. If you're going to sit down right now and say, okay, we're going to design a six-wheeled Widgeon flip with the drive wheels in the middle, there is some reference somewhere that you can look up, see if it's been done before, how it's been done, and then you work from there. We talk about this clean sheet of paper. You never really have a clean sheet of paper. I can only go back to sort of 91 for our first Jordan, the first F1 car that designed. Been involved with F1, seen lots of F1 cars, been up close to lots of F1 cars, engineered some F1 cars, engineered Formula 3000 cars, but never sat down with, as we call it, a clean sheet of paper. And I was determined at that point in time that I wasn't going to just pick up the best motoring magazine at the time and read through it and look at pictures, because I felt I needed to know, or we needed to know as a team, what the car was consisted of. And we ended up following our own path, following our own aeromap route. The diffuser and that was quite different in that car. Front wing was different. Lots of things were quite different in that car, but it was to follow our route for sensitivities, how the car worked under braking, downforce wise. It was a sort of unique piece of kit in a way. It didn't have the downforce of others, but it had good downforce, and that was important for me because we were going into a year of pre-qualifying for at least 6 months, and a year of unknown circuits. We've never been to them before, so we had to get the best out of the car pretty quickly. And the only way we could do that was to actually understand the car. So you sit down with a clean sheet of paper and you put things on it that you say, okay, I want to do that because of this. I want, the driver's situation, the steering wheel heights, all that stuff. You have to sort of work out those basics, and then you normally would build a sort of mock-up thing and set a driver in it to find out the steering wheel is in the right position, the gear change is in the right position, all that sort of stuff. But the actual design and development part of it, I think you have to do it all to suit what you understand and what you want from the car. Because then when it comes to the circuit and setting it up and optimizing it, you can get the best out of it.
Another question on design, this one from Aniko Tutor, is what are some of the techniques you used when you were designing cars, i.e. music, silence, or just plain thinking?
I like peace. I didn't like the music in the background. I didn't like phones, anything like that personally. I like to get peace. Even still now, currently, I can't do stuff with the TV on in the background or music on in the background. I need to concentrate and focus on what I'm doing, and that I think you have to get away from that other stuff. Some people are different. I'm not. Thinking about stuff, I've seen myself driving the car for 2 or 3 hours and not even knowing where I've been because you're just thinking on stuff. And that's the time when you get that peace, you can sort of evaluate things in your head, think of other solutions. Normally when you come to sort of scheme them up, they're just rubbish because, there's lots of things you haven't thought about. But at the end of the day, it sort of stimulates your thought pattern a little bit here and there. So I like peace, I like to focus, I like to concentrate. And even still, at the moment, as I say, I don't like to be interrupted whenever I'm involved in something.
Question about the regulations from Damien Gay. Says, Adrian Newey got bored of designing F1 cars to restrictive regulations. Do the new regulations for 2022 inspire an engineer like yourself, or do you share his point of view?
I think they would interest me for a year, and then I think it would get quite boring. I think at the minute there's room to think that there's an advantage to be found somewhere if you can dig deep enough into it. They're very prescriptive. So it's not going to be easy. If you step it back just for a year or even to this year as such, I think the regulations they're required, but it takes away any sort of concept thought. You can't think now of doing the Brabham fan car, or the Tyrrell 6-wheeler, or none of that stuff. There is no room for any of that anymore. If you look back at times and you look at the Brabham fan car, the Tyrrell 6-wheeler. They were big major concept changes, but there's no room for that anymore in the regulations the way they are. So it's all about fine detail. It's all about minute detail. And that detail had to also be done on the Brabham fan car and the Tyrrell. But you had a difference right through the whole company. You had people who would optimize stuff, and then you had people who would come up with the concept and follow it through. And I think we've got to a point now where that's all taken away, and people like Adrian Newey, they're starved of what they're really capable of. I would find myself starved in what I'm really capable of achieving, because I'm not somebody who loves to just do this little fine detail and just optimize it. Whether you use a 3mm screw in this thing or a 4mm screw, that's just fine detail. The turning vanes on the barge boards. It's 1 degree changes on it, or a square corner instead of a radius corner can make massive differences, but they're all just small detail stuff. It doesn't really make me very enthusiastic about design of a Formula 1 car.
A question now from Hugh Perizzi, who says, what's your favourite constructor to work for?
You'd have to say it was Jordan. Obviously, we set the team up and it was great to be part of that, and Stuart Grand Prix when I went to work with Jackie. Both Eddie and Jackie were very different people, but both unique to work for in their own little way. So that was obviously very nice. I think looking back at the sort of older days when I worked for Brabham, that's where I sort of learned most of my trade in a way. Gordon Murray was somebody who had time for everyone. And when you're trying to sort of build your reputation a little bit away from being a mechanic and to development and stuff, it's important to have that. And Gordon would take the time to sort of talk about stuff with you. So that was a great time as well. So I don't think there is a favourite. I think they're all different. as far as constructors today are concerned, to be honest, I like a challenge. So I would have said that the challenge that's there that probably could bring you the most return would be Williams, and the fact that they have most of what they need to do a good job, and they just need some help to do that job. But I'm not saying I want to go there and work by any means. I'm just saying that would be the team I'd look at now as the potential for a successful future with, but not achieving it at the moment and needs a restructure to achieve that.
Connor Skidmore says, if every F1 driver in 2020 drove an identical car, how big a gap do you think there would be between first and 20th?
Maybe less than what there is now, but there would still be a gap. And I think any formula shows that. There's always going to be one at the front and one at the back. If you take F2 or F3, as we know at the moment, any formula that's really a one-make formula, like the Indy cars, there is differences in how the team operate, what the driver wants from the car. So although the car can be the same visual-looking piece of kit, there's a hell of a lot inside of running it correctly and adapting it to the driver's needs, and obviously the driver's level as well. So there'll be a 1 to 20th on the grid. The gap, as I say, might just close up a little bit because the difference in the drivers from 1 to 20 at the moment is less than the difference in the cars from 1 to 20. So you would say it would close up a little bit. I don't know what it would be. It's hard to say. If you take a general average over whenever we see competitive cars, you're usually looking at a tenth to 0.2 of a second being Mr. Average, between two teammates in the same car. So you'd have to just extrapolate that through. So the grid might end up being 2 seconds from front to back if it was that close, or knocking on the door of maybe 3 seconds. But I think it would be smaller than what it is currently.
A question from David O'Reilly, looking ahead to the Belgian Grand Prix this weekend. Your cars and their antecedents as far down as Force India have always done well at Spa. What design philosophy caused this?
That's a tough one to answer for anybody, I think. But I think one of the things that we did push for from the very beginning of Jordan was the sort of efficiency level. And I think we had... we sort of bought into a better efficiency level than most teams, because I think we felt that we were never going to get the top line engines, so you had to have a car that was pretty efficient aerodynamically, so your straight line speed was reasonable. How that happens, you basically have a downforce level from A to Z that you can generate, and that each of those downforce levels gives you a drag level, and that drag level is relative to the horsepower you have, gives you the speed in the straight. And you pick a point on that curve where you do most of your development around. So you develop the car, let's say, now I'm just using these figures at the top of my head, maybe your efficiency curve goes from 3 to 1, let's say, to 4 to 1. And you pick a point in that curve somewhere where you feel there is most races, the level of downforce you would use. Most races are at that sort of level of downforce. So you pick, let's say, 3.6 to 1, and you'll develop the car around that point. You'll optimize the car around that point. And then each side of that, you'll put stuff on the car that isn't as well refined, I suppose you might call it. And that would, you'd put bits in the car for Hungary and Monaco that hadn't got the time spent on them, or you put parts in the car for Monza that hadn't got the time spent on them. But you'd always optimize the car around a certain point. And I suppose we picked point at that time of around Spa. And, maybe that's just stuck. Maybe that's just the area where they optimize their car at. Other people might optimize it for a different level of downforce, just a bit higher downforce or a bit lower downforce, and do all their work around that. So it's a difficult one to really know, to be honest, what happens and how it's happened, how it's been so much continuity. But I'm looking forward to this weekend with Racing Point and their pink, whatever it's called these days, because they have a good car there. They're showing that they've got two pretty good drivers, and just be interesting to see if they can reap the benefit of Spa that's been very good to that factory in Silverstone up to now, no matter what the name was.
Another related question from Louis Messier is that George Russell has complained about the Williams being too draggy on the straights. What makes this a difficult problem for Williams to solve, and what are options for addressing this issue?
Well, it's probably exactly the same as what I'm talking about. It's quite funny because whenever this hybrid era started in 2014, they were one of the cars that you would have said was the most efficient on the straights. I mean, they were very, very quick in the straights. They had as good an engine as Mercedes, but they were always faster than Mercedes on the straights. And they were competitive-ish with Mercedes. So they weren't too far out of bed. And then they went through this era of having a bad car. And they've probably changed themselves now, and they're pursuing getting more downforce on the car at the expense of efficiency. And you can only do that so much. As I say, every circuit has a compromise between straight line speed and cornering. Spa is a typical example of one that's going to be quite difficult. The first section at Spa, it's all flat out. You just want low downforce and Monza wings on the car if you could run them. The mid-section of the track requires downforce, so you put downforce on for that. And the last section of the track is like the first. It just requires straight line speed. A little bit more downforce because of a couple of corners on it, but not that much. So you end up with the compromise that allows those three to happen. The thing you do have at Spa, any track, you've got the horsepower you've got. That's the thing that doesn't really change too much. So you have to compromise the setup of the car to go with the horsepower you've got. And as I say, Williams have probably done the opposite to what Racing Point will have done for this year. They've tried to pile downforce on the car to get the tyre grip, and at that they've paid the price in drag, and the car is very draggy on the straight. So so it is a compromise. It's a balancing act between the two. There's never a simple answer to it. But Williams can go away and fix that. I mean, they can run different wings on the car. It's all adjustable. But whenever they do that, then they haven't got the downforce. So all they can do as Williams is to get the best downforce to drag compromise they can for the best lap time. And whatever that best lap time is, that's where they stand at. And that's where you need to start developing the car at. So they can learn a lesson from this if they have gone that route, but they need to learn it quite quickly.
Next up, we've got a two-part question from Tristan Cooper. The first part is, why is no one using counter-current flow radiators? And the second part is that most of the exhaust energy is in the blowdown pulse. By separating this pulse from the residual exhaust gas stream, a large reduction in back pressure could be achieved. Why is this not being done? So first part first, counter-current flow radiators. It's probably worth defining them before you get into the detail. Counter-current flow. Basically, you've got an ambient temperature and you've got a water temperature. Let's say the ambient temperature is 30 degrees. The water coming out of the engine will probably be about 120 degrees. These cars run very, very hot. So the best cooling is where that 30-degree airflow hits the 120 degree water. And as the water cools, it'll probably go back into the engine at 105 degrees or something. It doesn't cool that much. But sort of at the other end of the radiator, you've got the water coming out then at 105 degrees and you've still got 30-degree ambient, so you have less cooling efficiency. It sort of happens in the design of the ducts. You do, obviously, if you've seen underneath the side pods of one of these cars, it's a fairly complicated piece of kit. The radiator, you pack everything into the minimum area you can, so it's all fairly compact in that area. But the duct design would be such that you would have the mass flow where the water's coming into the radiator, and if there's any reduction in flow, like at the top of the radiator where the radiator itself is smaller, you would have less airflow going through there. But the thing you want to do is to make sure that the airflow through the radiator is fairly uniform, just because you don't want any areas of separation. And if you've got an area of separation in the duct because of a corner somewhere, then you get no cooling in that area. So you'd say it does happen sort of automatically. It's not a sort of a defined thing that they do. Would it be better? You probably could look at a fraction better cooling if you could really optimize it to the 10th degree, but you can't quite do that. So as I say, everything, I use this word compromise far too often, but everything is a compromise. And to exploit that to the maximum, you'd probably end up compromising something else. So you do the best you can within the constraints of how you flow the water through the radiator, so that there's more hot water mass in there at the beginning than there is cool water mass coming out. As far as the exhaust pulses are concerned, it's probably just because of the regulations. I sort of agree with what you're saying. I'm not the biggest understanding of the exhaust gas pulses. Of something I haven't really been involved with.
I've been more involved with the airbox and how the normally aspirated engines, how the airbox worked with the pulses of the trumpets inside the airbox, and how the pulse in one trumpet can affect the pulse in the next trumpet. And if the firing order is not right, the two of them see each other, and it does make a big difference to the power and the fuel used. But as far as the exhaust pulses are concerned, there is a very restrictive exhaust system in these cars, a single turbo, V6 engine, and the exhausts, you can't do much with them, to be honest. You've got the single turbo with a single outlet, and you've got two wastegates you've got a wastegate with the twin outlet, and that's it. So you can't really do much with it. So I don't know what it would take to exploit this exhaust gas separation, but it probably would contravene the regulations fairly dramatically with the constraints that we have currently.
And the final question that will fit in is from Robert Wilson, who says, is it only a matter of time until F1 becomes a completely electric series? And if so, when do you think this will happen?
Well, I certainly hope not. You'll tell when it happens, because that's the day that I'll probably hang up my pen. Because for me, the Formula One, the noise, the speed, it all comes from that. I really, really don't really like the electric side of things completely. I mean, I was once almost run down at a fuel station when a Toyota Prius came in to get fuel in it, and it was running on electric. Why should an electric car come into a petrol station? That's the first thing I'd like to say, but it almost ran me over. But it's one of those sort of things. I think the noise, the glitz and glamour, we have to have a formula that is still fossil fuel driven. I think the hybrid thing, it's okay, but it does just take away from that pure spirit of noisy, high revving, massively powerful engines. The V10 thing was at 20,000 RPM, knocking on over 1,000 horsepower. That was real engines, I suppose, for me. That's what, if I had to sort of sit down now and say I'm going to build this super formula, that would be the direction I'd be heading in with engines. Maybe not the 20,000 RPM. You'd have to cut back on some things just to restrict it. But then you just put in a fuel usage that you can do. It's all quite possible now. So you cut it back that way. But I don't foresee it going fully electric. I think there's room for an electric series, and we've got that right now. But it hasn't got the glitz and glamour of Formula One.
Well, I'm sorry to say that is all we've got time for, so apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to. Some of those we didn't answer have been tackled in previous episodes, in particular last week's, where Gary judged various listener suggestions for ways to improve F1. So perhaps check back for that episode if you had a question that was a little bit more about F1's current regulations. Thanks very much to everyone who asked a question. We're going to keep doing these Ask Gary Anything episodes relatively regularly, so please keep them coming in. We do appreciate it. We're going to turn our attention now to the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, and we'll be back next week with more from Gary.